What I'm going to talk about today is causal reinforcement learning. I'll try to explain what I mean by that. And in particular, we'll look at the problem of using observational data in reinforcement learning when this data is confounded. So I'll try to explain what that means. So maybe you've heard about causal inference, do calculus, confounding, interventions, potential outcomes. I mean, there is a lot of jargon around causality, which is maybe hard to follow, and the literature is not very well unified on those concepts. So it can be hard to understand like what's going on, why is it useful. And the question we try to answer is, can the tools from causality offer practical solutions to RL, to reinforcement learning? And we'll try to answer that question. And what I believe is that causality cannot offer you, is not the right tool to deal with statistical learning, to deal with regular supervised learning in machine learning. Causality will not bring much here. However, I believe that in reinforcement learning, where you need to act in the world, it really makes sense to think about causality. So in this talk, I will first present a bit what is causality with Judea-Pearl's do calculus framework, which is quite intuitive. I will talk about the big problem in causality, which is confounding, that everyone tries to tackle. And then we'll talk about a few use cases in offline reinforcement learning where you have this causal question coming up. And finally, I will present like the method, the paper that we wrote, which goes a bit beyond do calculus and merges observational and interventional data to obtain a better model of the world. So let's start with causality. I will use the framework of Judea-Pearl to talk about causality, which is based on directed graphs, and do calculus. So do calculus is a tool which takes as an input an observational distribution. So you just observe some random variables of a system. You are also given the causal graph of the system, so you know the causal graph. And you can ask questions in the form of causal queries. Like, for example, what is the probability of B given do of A? So that means, how will the probability of B change given that I act on variable A? So you take this distribution, this graph, and this query, and do calculus tells you yes or no, you can answer that question. And if yes, it will also give you the formula to answer that question. So let's look at a few examples. In the first one, this first causal graph here, so we are interested in measuring the causal effect from A to B, probability of B given that we act on A. And here it's very straightforward, because as you can see, all the path from A to B, they're all directed in one direction, from A to B. So the edge AB is causal in the direction from A to B, and the path ACB is also causal. So when you measure directly probability of B given A, you will measure all those relationships that will be included in your measure, and all those relationships are causal. So here you don't have much to do. You can just measure what's the probability of B given A, and this is actually the answer to your causal question. That's the ideal case. If we look at the second example, this one, so here A is a cause of C, B is a cause of C, and A is a cause of B. And here again, it's trivial to measure your causal effect, because you can see that there is a path, A, C, B, which is not causal. All the arrows don't go to the right. But that's not an issue, because in this particular graph, on this path, the variable C acts as a V structure, which means this path is blocked. There is no information flowing from A to B through variable C. So if you're familiar with D-separation in graphical models, this is exactly what it is. The variable C D-separates A and B on this path. So if you measure probability of B given A, you only measure the path at the top, the direct path, which is causal. So again, here, nothing particular to do. You can directly measure this quantity, and it is causal. However, in this third scenario, we have that variable C is a cause of A and a cause of B. And that's called a confounding variable. Because if you measure P of B given A, this time you will measure the path from A to B, which is causal, but you will also include the path A, C, B, which is not causal. And here there is no V structure to block the path. So if you measure P of B given A, you will not measure a causal relationship. And this is the main problem that causality tries to face. So if you ask do calculus, how can I answer my query? Do calculus tells you yes, you can answer the query if you know the variable C, and then you apply this little formula, which basically conditions on variable C. When you condition on C, you block the path A, C, B. And this is called the deconfounding formula. So if you observe variable C, you can actually you can actually measure the causal effect by deconfounding on variable C. And what it does is it will basically remove that edge. Virtually, it will remove that edge here from C to A, and then you get a causal measure. And of course, something I didn't tell you is that if you have an observational distribution like that, you need to apply deconfounding. But if you have access to the system and you are able to act directly on the variable A and then measure the effect on variable B, then you don't need do calculus. You don't need deconfounding. If you are able to act on the system and then measure directly the outcome, you will measure the causal query that you want to measure.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
Yeah. I was just wondering what is the relation between these formulas and Bayesian inference? Because I guess the observational distribution is basically the joint distribution over the three variables, right?
The observational distribution is this one, yes, the joint distribution of A, B, and C.
Okay. So yeah, typically Bayesian inference will give you, for example, the formula for P of B knowing A or whatever other conditional distribution.
Yes.
And it seems the one you are proposing are maybe different for the causal aspect.
So it's very related. I mean, you also apply a Bayes rule to just integrate a variable. In Bayesian inference, you want to integrate over a prior distribution, and here you integrate over a confounding variable. It's related in that sense, but it's not the same meaning. Here, A, B, and C are three variables of your system. In Bayesian inference, you would integrate over parameters. You would set a prior distribution on parameters, and you would integrate that. So it looks similar, but it's not really related.
Okay, thanks.
Yes, in a nutshell, do calculus actually connects observational distributions and interventional distributions. It acts as a bridge to answer interventional queries from observational distributions, basically, and vice versa. Okay, so I told you the big issue, the big deal with causality is confounding. So say that you have a system like this one with three variables, but you don't observe variable C. You only observe A and B. Then do calculus tells you, sorry, you cannot identify your causal query. There is a hidden confounder. You cannot measure it, so there is no way that you can measure P of B given 2 of A. So the problem is when the confounder is hidden. sometimes still you can still manage to recover the causal query that you're interested in. This formula is called, I think, the front door adjustment formula. You can find it in Perl's textbook. So it's a bit tricky, but basically, if you observe an intermediate variable D between A and B, which is not an effect of C, then you can use that variable to first measure the causal link between D and B, and then the causal link between A and D. And if you know both those links, you can know the global relationship. And I think it was used, for example, to demonstrate the causal effect of smoking on lung cancer. So you could say, okay, people smoking, they have more cancer, but maybe there is a hidden confounder. Maybe there is a gene, a special gene in yourself, which at the same time makes you want to smoke, and at the same time gives you more cancer. And then it would really be this gene that would cause your cancer, and not the fact that you smoke directly. And what you can come up with is okay, but smoking also causes an intermediate step, which is that it puts tar in your lungs. So and you can postulate that probably the tar is what causes the cancer, and the tar is not an effect of your gene. So you can kind of formulate this causal graph, and you can agree that okay, this causal graph makes sense. And if you agree on that, then you measure smoking, you measure the level of tar, and you measure the level of cancer in a population. Then you can actually answer the causal query without even measuring the hypothetical gene that could exist. So you can do interesting things like that with do calculus.
Can I ask, just in the formula, what's A prime?
Oh, sorry, that just means you integrate over the distribution P of A, but it's a different, so it's still the variable A, but it's a different value from A. So there is A here, the original value, which you're interested in when you measure the causal effect. And A prime is just, okay, this part on the right, it's not related to the original value A. You just integrate over all values A prime.
Oh, I see. And P of B given D and A, that's...
Yeah, P of B given D and A prime. So it's not the value A, it's another value A prime. So maybe the formula is a bit technical, but really what you can see is that to measure the link between D and B, you condition on A, and this cuts the backward path here, which is not causal. And then to measure the link between A and D, you can just measure it directly, P of D given A, because the path, which is not causal here, is already blocked by variable B. This is a V structure. There are two arrows pointing towards each other. So on the left, you have the link between A and D. On the right, the link between D and B, where you have to apply deconfounding. And then you integrate over variable D to just have the global relationship between A and B.
I see. I mean, yeah, it's not very intuitive, because B still depends on C, right? And it's sort of weird.
Yeah, it's. I mean, it's very intuitive once you kind of understand how the graph relates to the formula, but it takes some experience in directed graphs, d-separation, to kind of figure out the thing. But I invite you to read Perl's textbook, which has a lot of nice examples like this one, and is much more detailed. Okay, so let's keep going. So to measure causal effects, you need either to make interventions on the system. So if you can intervene on variable A, for example, you take a population of people and you take 50% of them randomly and you force them to smoke. Then, I don't know, 20 years later, you measure how many of them got cancer. Then you have your measure of the causal effect from smoking to cancer. Of course, you immediately see that this is a bit problematic. You cannot really do that. In some cases, you can. With in medicine, it's done like for the COVID vaccine, you do randomized trials with medicine. But with stuff like smoking cigarettes, you can arguably not force people to smoke cigarettes. So yeah, that's a way to do things, but sometimes it's a bit problematic. And another way to measure causal effects is just to observe the system. So you just measure some variables on the population. And if you have knowledge of the causal graph, or if you have good reasons to defend some kind of causal graph, like this one I showed you, then you can apply do calculus and actually measure the causal effects by correcting the confounding that may be in the data. Okay, so those are the two ways to measure causal effects. And how does all of this relate to reinforcement learning? So this will be the point of the next section with causal reinforcement learning. So if we look at reinforcement learning under the general formulation with POMDPs, where you don't have access to the full state, but just an observation, a noisy observation for the state, then you actually have a causal graph, which relies on the arrow of time, basically. You know that only the past can affect the future, and there is no way the future will affect the past retrospectively. So you know the direction of the arrows, and you know that your actions affect the future state, previous state affect the future state. So the causal graph is really clearly defined, and it's by definition, it's exactly like that. So there is no question about what the causal graph looks like. Then in reinforcement learning, you actually act on variables. You act on the variable A here. You do actions on the system, and you would like to measure what is the outcome of those actions. So if you have a robot doing stuff in the wild, when it activates, I don't know, an arm or something, you would like to know, okay, how will that affect the environment and the world and the robot itself? So you really want to measure causal effects. And a nice way to see causality in reinforcement learning is to think about model-based RL. So in model-based RL, you first want to estimate a causal model, which is the transition model, basically. You would like to estimate the transition model of the world. So what will be the probability of the next observation, given the past, basically, the past observation and the past actions that I made on the system. So the first step is to learn this model. This is the model of model-based RL. And then the second step is you use this causal model to derive your optimal policy. Given that you know the causal model of the world, you can then derive what the optimal policy is to maximize some outcome. So if you formulate things like that, the first model that you want to learn is causal. So how do you identify this causal model? Well, you can just ask do calculus because you have the graph. And do calculus tells you it's trivially identifiable. There is no big deal here. There is no confounding, so you can just use observational data. You can just observe a robot or whatever, like acting in the system. You collect this data and you can learn the transition model, which is causal. So your causal transition model, you can directly estimate it using the data that you collect by observing an agent in the system. And this boils down to regular model-based RL. So why even talking about causality and telling you that this model is causal if in the end you just get regular model-based RL? Because in some settings, things are not as trivial. So let's look at a non-standard reinforcement learning setting. And what I mean by that is, so to explain you the idea, let's look at a problem, at a toy example. So this is called the door problem. You have a door with a light on it, which can be either green or red. If it's green, then you should push the left button and it will open the door. If it's red, you should push the right button and it will open the door. Okay. So you have this variable S, the hidden state, which is the color of the door. You have the action A, and then the reward is the door open or not? And I'm telling you that the state is hidden because I will consider that the learning agent is colorblind. The learning agent cannot observe the hidden state of the door. Is it green or red? So your agent is colorblind, but imagine you sit in a room and you see people interacting with the door, okay? So you see people coming and they are not colorblind, so they can look at the color and decide which button to push based on that color. So in this system, the hidden state will affect the actions. So you will see people doing actions based on the color that's on the door. And the hidden state will affect the reward, and also the action will affect the reward. And really, the whole system is defined in those tables. So we consider an initial state with 40% chances of being green, 60% chances of being red. And then, of course, if you push, so if, say, the state is 0, you have to push 0 to get a reward of 1. If the state is 1, you have to push 1 to get a reward of 1. I mean, those are colors, but it's just 0 and 1 in this table. And you can imagine that you observe someone playing like that. When the state is 0, it will mostly push the right button, but sometimes it will make mistakes. When the state is 1, it will mostly push the right button, but it will also sometimes make mistakes. Okay, so we have this setting where you can collect observational data of this system. And then you want to answer this question, okay, what is my optimal action? Which button should I push to open the door? So which button maximizes this probability of having a reward given the action? So maybe you can already answer that question if you figured out what's going on. So do you think, so the colorblind agent does not see the color, so it cannot rely on any kind of information. It just has to decide what is the best button to push for me. Should I always push left or should I always push right? What do you think?
Right.
Right. So yes, that would be the one here. Because the door is mostly green or red, if we say this is red. So it's mostly in the state 1. So mostly you should push button 1, and you have 60% chances of opening the door. That's your optimal action. Can you derive this optimal action and this causal model from the data you observe? So you observe only action reward samples. You're observing someone else. The answer is no, you can't. DoCalculus tells you it's not identifiable. You could identify this query if you had observed the state S and applied deconfounding. But if you don't observe S, you cannot. If you look at the table that you observe, P of R given A, you would see that when people push the left button, they have 80% chances of opening the door. When people push the right button, they have 67% chances. So what you would infer if you were to use this data is, oh, it looks like the left button is better. And you would end up with a non-optimal policy. And even if you do imitation learning from this data, so you observe that people play like that, 30% left, 70% right, you would end up with a policy which is also suboptimal. So you can see that when you collect observational data, in this situation where the agent that you observe, they rely on information that is hidden to you, there is confounding happening, and you cannot directly estimate the transition model from this data. On the other hand, if you are able to act on the system, so say you get up from your chair and you go and push the buttons and see what's happening on the door, then quickly you would realize that the right button is the best, and you would observe this, which is exactly the causal model that you are interested in. You would see that the right button is the right choice. So I'm telling you that in such a situation, which is non-standard RL, so you can see that as offline RL, you have a data set of observation action, which you collected in the wild. If this dataset is confounded, if the agent that made the action used hidden information, that you cannot use this model to derive your causal model. And I argue that in some practical situations, it's very cheap to collect observational data, while making interventions on the system might be more expensive. If you think about robotics, for example, it's hard to collect data from a robot acting outside, but maybe it's easier to collect data from a human controlling the robot. DoCalculus only tells you, no, you cannot rely on observational data, you have to use intervention data. But do we just have to throw away observational data? Can we not use it in some way to help our system learn? So the question is the following: can we combine interventional and observational data to get a better estimate of the transition model? And here are a few real-world use cases where confounding actually happened. So the main setting is offline RL. And the question is, okay, I have a data set of observation actions. Is it confounded? In self-driving cars, it might be the case. If you consider a robot that the robot wants to learn how to drive a car, and you only have a small camera in front of the car with a limited field of vision. You collect data from human drivers. Okay, you can ask people to drive the cars, and you collect at the same time what's in front of the camera and what the human is doing. Then, of course, the human driver has a larger field of vision than your robot. And also it can hear things, maybe it has more information from the outside somehow. So the human driver will rely on information that is not available to the robot. And this will lead to confounding. Say, for example, when the human driver sees someone on the side of the road that wants to cross the road, the human driver will press the pedal to brake, to stop the car. So what will happen from the robot's perspective is that the brake pedal is pushed, and then someone crosses in front of the camera. So it may wrongly infer that the causal model is, whenever I push the brake pedal, someone appears in front of the car. And you can see that this can be problematic. If you want to teach your robot to not hurt anyone on the roads, maybe your robot will want to avoid a situation where someone is in front of the car. So maybe the robot will just deduce, okay, I should never push the brake pedal. And that might be an issue. Another obvious use case where confounding can happen is with dynamic treatment regimes in medicine. So this is where you have patients coming to a doctor, the doctor gives them a medicine, then a few weeks later they come back again with new symptoms or that their state evolved, and then the doctor will maybe change the medicine and give them another treatment and so on. So it's something sequential. And again, you can imagine that it's hard to just try treatments on people and see what's happening. But it's very easy to collect observational data from doctors, from hospitals, for example. And here again, the doctor may base its decisions on information that is not in the electronic record of the patients. Just because the doctor talks with the patient and they do physical exams, and they just have more information than what is in the electronic record. So again, this can lead to confounding. To see that, a quick example, does vitamin D cause osteoporosis? Or is it the opposite? Does vitamin D help fight osteoporosis? So the medical answer is that vitamin D helps fight osteoporosis. But if you just see someone in the street and I tell you, oh, this person takes vitamin D, then you can infer, most likely this person will have osteoporosis. So if you don't know why vitamin D was taken, you can infer that vitamin D has a negative effect on osteoporosis if you just look at observational data. Well, in reality, there is a confounding variable here, which is the doctor. So the doctor knows that the patient is at risk of developing osteoporosis, so it will give vitamin D. And also because the patient is at risk, it has more chances to develop osteoporosis. So there is a clear confounding here. And it's actually very often the case that there is confounding in medical data.
Can I have a question about the first one on self-driving cars? Because
yes,
you say typically the robot will infer the wrong thing, that it is the fact that the car push the brake pedal that then cause the pedestrian to appear.
Yeah.
In a sense, this is true, right? It's because the car stopped that the pedestrian actually crossed the road.
Yeah, in a sense, yeah. But also it so in the yes, so if there is someone standing next to the road and you push the pedal, then it will cause the pedestrian to cross.
Mm-hmm.
But you don't have this information that someone is standing on the side. So if you just drive a car randomly in the street and you push the brake pedal, it will not cause someone to cross in front of the car.
It will increase the probability that it happened, but.
Yes, but you will estimate this probability to be, I don't know, 90%, when in reality it's maybe 0.01%. You know, if I just stop my car randomly somewhere, there is a very little probability that someone will cross in front of the car.
Yeah, depending where you are, but yeah.
Yeah, so it might be there is a causal effect, but you will not estimate it correctly.
Yeah, because then you said, so then if the system uses actually this information to infer a policy, it will never break. For example, if the system...
Yeah, I mean, that's an overstatement.
Yeah, it's actually the optimal policy. If you don't want to have any pedestrian in front of you and you are a self-driving car, you just accelerate a lot and you will never have anybody in front of your car.
Yes, you're right. Yeah. Yeah, it's a bit of a simplification. It's just like, I mean, you get the general idea.
Yeah,
definitely. It's much more complex than that. And it's hard to say what will happen exactly due to confounding. But it will, of course, bias the causal model. So you will make maybe not such harsh decisions, but you will be biased in some sense. So you will not make optimal decisions.
Yeah, I get it. Okay, thanks.
Yep. Yes, so last one. This one is for you. Do you think there is confounding in Atari video games? What I mean is you collect a data set of human players playing Atari video games, and then you want to train an RL agent, a model-based RL agent, to learn a causal model. So that's a trick question. So maybe I will we just answer it. Arguably, no, there is no confounding here, because the models that you learn on Atari video games, they will use what information? The screen, so the pixels, that's all available. Also maybe the sound that's available, and a human will use the exact same information. It's hard to argue that a human would have more knowledge about the state of the game than the learning agent. So in that case, you can argue that confounding is not an issue if you just collect data from human players playing in Atari video games. So sometimes you can kind of guess if there might be confounding, or you can defend the idea that there is no confounding.
What would happen in the inverse case if the agent has more information than the human? For example, in Atari, if the agent has access to the RAM memory, for example, so the full state of the game.
So then there is no confounding.
Okay.
At the extreme, you can see that the expert that you observe, they may just play randomly, or they may just play with a fixed constant policy. They don't use any kind of information about the system, while your learning agent has access to some information. And in that case, there is no confounding. You can just use the data as it is.
Okay.
Okay, so let's move on to the next part. So I told you our idea is to try to still use the observational data, even if it's confounded, because we believe that it exists cases where you can have access to a large data set of observational data, but this data set is confounded. So for example, for self-driving cars, you can observe a lot of people driving on the road. It's kind of cheap to obtain. While you don't have many interventional data, it's hard to actually collect data from a robot driving on the roads. That there are many issues with collecting this kind of data. So we place ourselves in this situation where you have a lot of observational data and you still would like to use it. You don't want to just throw it away, right? Maybe there is some stuff to extract from this data. We will do it as follows. So if you look at the two regimes, so I go back to the door example, which is simple to understand. In the observational regime, the agent you observe will base its policy on the hidden state. So there is an arrow from S to A. In the interventional regime, where you acted on the system and you have no information about S, then the actions, there is no causal relationship between the state and the action. There is no arrow between S and E. So you have those two regimes, and you have data from those two regimes. So what you want to do is to fit a unique model that fits both those data, and that will learn a hidden variable. So you will fit a latent variable model, where you learn a latent variable that fits both the observational and the interventional data. So it looks like this model on the right. What you do basically is that you add an indicator variable I. So you collect samples I, A, R. When I is equals to 0, it means this sample comes from the observational regime. When I equals to 1, it comes from the interventional regime. So you mix all this data together with this indicator. And then you fit an augmented probabilistic graphical models, where this is the structure of the model, and you add this additional constraint. When I equals 1, when you are in the interventional regime, the actions do not depend on the state. So this translates into this statement. A is independent of S when I equals 1. That's a contextual independence statement. And that's an easy constraint that you can just put in the model in addition to the structure of the model. So in this model, you fit A, R, and I, and S is a latent variable. You will just learn a latent variable that fits this data. And once you have fit this model using both observational and interventional data, you can just recover the causal query, P of R given do of A, via deconfounding. You just apply the deconfounding formula by using the recovered latent variable. So that's the general idea. It's quite simple, actually. So it looks like this. How do you learn this model? Well, you just maximize log likelihood, but you could do anything. You could do expectation maximization. You could use an elbow maximization. You just want to fit basically this probabilistic model. And the constraints are you want to respect the structure of your model. So it decomposes into a product. And these additional constraints, which when I equals 1, actions do not depend on the hidden variable. So here's the variable that we learn. I call that Z. And at the end, you do causal inference by using this formula. You just deconfound using the variable Z. So why would that work? And first, does it work? Let's just train this model and see if it works. So we'll call this model Q augmented, so that the transition model that you learn from using the augmented data, both observational and interventional. And we'll compare this one to the no-ops model where you just use interventional data. This model is not biased. It will learn the causal transition model, but it will have less data. And we'll also compare to a naive baseline where let's just assume there is no confounding and mix all the data together and see what's happening. So if there is confounding, this model will be biased. If there is no confounding, it will be okay. So our data set looks like that. And we'll measure two things, the Jensen-Shannon divergence between the recovered model and the true causal model. So do we fit the causal model? And then the reward that you obtain with this. So let's evaluate this on our DOR example. And say that we set this policy here, which introduces confounding. So in the first curve, I plot the Jensen-Shannon divergence. So for the no-ops methods, you see that this goes down. So on the x-axis, we increase the number of interventional samples. So at some point, you have just enough interventional samples, and you just fit the causal model perfectly. And the number of observational samples is fixed to a large value. So I think we use 2 power 7 here for the size of the observational sample. So you see that the no-ops method converges to the right model. Our augmented method, which uses also the observational data, converges faster. So it's actually able to use the observational data to converge faster. It's more sample efficient. And then the naive method, which ignores the confounding effect, it kind of converges, but it will take a long time to have enough interventional data to correct the confounding that is in the observational data. And if you look at the reward, also we obtain small gains in terms of the reward, so we converge faster to the optimal policy. And those color maps at the bottom. So the first line is the reward, I think. Yes, the first line is the reward. And the second line is the Jensen-Shannon divergence. So what we do here is we just said, okay, let's vary the number of observational samples. So that's the y-axis. And then let's also vary the number of interventional samples. And let's see what is the regime where the method is useful. And what we expect is that when you have few interventional samples, but a lot of observational samples, so the top left, this corresponds to the real case scenarios where you have a lot of observations, which is cheap, but you have few interventions. And we would like to obtain gains in this region. And that's what we get. So when you don't use the observational data, it looks like you improve from left to right, but the observational data has no impact. It's just flat in the y direction. When you merge both data naively, you see that you have a decrease in performance, actually. The data is biased, your model performs worse. And when you merge them with our augmented method, you can see that you indeed obtain a gain in the regime that we are interested in. So here we just show the difference. So our method is better when it's green, and you see that it's green mostly in the top left corner. So that's what we want. And at the bottom, we do the same thing, but for the Jensen-Shannon divergence. So here, the lower, the better. And you see that again, you obtain gains mostly in the top left region. So it looks like the method is useful in this particular region. Then what's nice is that this is a synthetic toy problem, so you can repeat this experiment a lot of times by changing things. So what happens if the agent that you see is perfect? So it always pushes the right button on the door. Then you also have a bias, and our method also converges faster in terms of the causal model and in terms of reward. If the agent is perfectly bad, so it might be that the agent you observe does not use the same reward function as you. So it might be they always push the wrong button on purpose. Then the same effect basically happens. The data is also biased. If the agent you observe is random, it actually means that they don't use the state to make decisions. So there is no confounding. In that case, the naive method is actually correct. There is no confounding, so the assumption of the naive method is satisfied. And you can see that the naive method performs extremely well. From the start, it will converge to the right causal model. And our method fails a little bit in some regimes, but mostly sticks also to the naive baseline. So even when there is no confounding, our method is still correct. There are some flukes here, but mostly it's not too bad. If you observe a positively biased agent, like this one, so this one makes sure that when it presses button 1, it's only in the when the system is in the wrong state. So it will only press button 1 and fail. So what you will see is that button 1 always fails, while button 0 fails half of the time, mostly. So that's a strong bias. So the optimal button here is 0, by the way. So that's a strong positive bias. You will learn a causal model which is really biased, but in the good direction. If you derive the optimal action from this model, we'll have the correct action. But you will really overestimate the effect of that action. So you can see that in terms of the causal model recovered, it's also biased, and our method converges faster to the correct model. But in terms of the reward, the naive method is very good from the start because it has a positive bias. So this all makes sense. Same, you can impose a negative bias on the system. So the expert can play in a way that the observer will think that, action 1 sometimes gives you positive rewards, but action 0 never gives you positive reward. Wait, or the other way around? Yes, action 0 always gives you a positive reward. Action 1 sometimes fails, so you will think action 0 is the best. I'm a bit confused, but this one gives you a negative bias, basically. It will make you think that the optimal action is actually the non-optimal action. So same stuff. Our model converges faster to the correct one. But this time, if you look at the naive method, it's really very biased in a very negative direction, and it will take a lot of time to actually correct this bias. So maybe I'll go quickly. We are near to the end. Why does it work? We have some results that show that when you fit an augmented model like the one I presented, if we assume that the model has a high enough capacity to fit the data, then the model is not biased. And what we can show also is that if you have an infinite amount of observational data, what happens is that your causal model will be bounded. You will bound what the causal model can learn. So in that sense, like the causal queries, they will be greater or equal than some quantity that you can get from the observational data, and less equal than some other quantity that you get from observational data. So what this means is that when you have enough observational data, it will regularize the causal model that you can learn. So it will not be able to fit crazy distributions on the interventional data. It will be regularized. And of course, if you fit a model that's regularized and that is not biased, that still can encode the correct causal model, then you will have better generalization expectations on the interventional data. So you can show that you can kind of explain why this works with this reasoning. Okay, so we only talk about a bandit, which is a very simple problem. But what about general POMDPs? Well, you can show that the same applies. You can fit a latent variable model, which has to be sequential, kind of like an HMM. And this time you have to impose this additional contextual independency. So this I variable affects all the actions and will affect also the arrow from ST to T plus 1, to AT, sorry. And because of, and you can also derive similar bounds, and because of, so they're a bit more complex, but because of those bounds, you can argue that the model generalizes better also. And we actually tested on a simple POMDP, so we took this grid world problem. Again, our method converges faster to the true causal model, and in terms of rewards, it also converges faster to the optimal policy. And you can see that you actually gain, I would say, 1 order of magnitude in terms of when your model starts actually using the data in a meaningful way. So with our method, we start having gains at around 2^7 data. And the other methods, both, they start having gains at 2^8, 2^8, 2^9. And if you look at this particular regime, when the number of interaction data is 2^7, you can see that the 2 other baselines, the agents basically stay in the top part of the room. So I didn't explain this grid world, but your agent starts at the top left and has to go to a specific tile at the bottom, and there is a wall in the middle. So you have to explore quite a bit before you understand that you can cross the wall and then get to the wall. And so, yes, you can see that our method, it starts actually learning that it can cross the wall and actually going for it at around 2^7 interaction data. What the 2 other baselines need more data to figure that out. So to conclude, did we answer our question? Can the tools from causality offer solutions to practical reinforcement learning problem? I would say yes, because reinforcement learning problems are causal. So because they are causal, all those tools from causality can be applied, and they can actually solve practical problems like the one we discussed. And what are we looking forward to next? So you can imagine different situations where you observe distinct agents. Each agent will have a different confounding. And this would actually be beneficial. Like if you observe human drivers, it would be beneficial to separate those drivers into different agents and to assume that they may have different confoundings. And you can show that in terms of bounds, you should obtain a better regularization of your model. Of course, we would like to experiment this idea on more challenging reinforcement learning settings, maybe with pixel-based environments. That's a bit more tricky, but we are going for that. Generalizing our method to other training algorithms. So what I presented was about just fitting the model with maximizing the log likelihood, which is a bit of a naive way of doing things. But it works in low-dimensional settings, so maybe expand the algorithm to more general training algorithms. And also, we can draw a very clear similarities with recent work from Hafner et al. At ICLR, where they basically fit discrete transition models to very complex tasks on Atari games, and they show that it works. You can actually make it work. So that's promising, like as a way to expand our method to this setting, because the model they use is very similar to the one we use. It's a discrete transition model. Yes, some ideas we have is to maybe look at the situation where the observed agent is complex. Maybe it has a very complex policy, which the learning agent cannot learn because it doesn't have the same capacity. So would that be similar to a confounding scenario? Like if the observed agent uses hidden information, or if the observed agent uses information in a complex way that you cannot use, is it the same thing? So we'd like to investigate that. There is a question of exploration, which we haven't tackled also, which should be combined with the method. Yeah, and a few other ideas, like what happens when the actions are also hidden. It may be that you don't observe the actions in the observation regime. So you could try to apply the same framework, same ideas, and see what happens. If you want to know more, the paper is an archive, and you are encouraged to have a look. And if you have any questions, feel free to get back to me or to Pierre-Yves or one of the authors. Thank you so much.